All right. I am now joined by Conrad Hamilton and Matt McManus, who have both been on here before. But one recent thing that's worth mentioning in this context is that they are the co-authors of this article in defense of Slavoj Žižek in Jacobin. Conrad, you want to say a few words about what this article is?
Yeah, well, I think this was Matt's idea, sort of, to do the article. But in essence, we were responding to certain controversies, which perhaps aren't so relevant to my intellectual domain, so I can't run down too much. But the essence of the article is that we acknowledge, I think, some of the criticisms that have been lodged against Žižek and their potential validity with respect to his comments about refugees and his ostensible endorsement of Trump. That was more Matt's sort of purview. And then we run through Žižek's thought and try to provide an account of why it could be deemed important for our time. So we mostly deal with his theory of dialectical materialism, which I tackled, which I found very hard. I mean, imagine compressing Hegel to these magazine sound bites, right? I really, really racked my brain about that one. And then the second part, which Matt mostly dealt with, deals with Žižek's theory of ideology. So that's kind of the basis of it.
Yeah, is there anything you want to add to that, Matt?
Sure, yeah. Well, like the major piece that we were responding to was a piece that came out in Current Affairs a couple of years ago. Basically, knocking Slavoj Žižek, that created a very lengthy and sometimes fiery bit of controversy on the political left. Žižek responded in Philosophical Salon, and then there was a bit of a back and forth between the two, which, needless to say, was not particularly productive. But what we want to do is offer a kind of accessible, interesting guide to his thought that highlighted some of the more intellectually robust arguments that he's put forward, beyond all the shit jokes, cinema analysis, debates with the Lobster King and all that kind of stuff. But what I try to do in my section is foreground what I thought was really distinctive about his approach to ideology. Because the kind of classical theory of ideology put forward by vulgar Marxism, amongst other disciplines, was basically a regurgitation of the old Platonic idea, right? That what ideology is a screen that kind of keeps you from seeing the world the way that it really is, right? And if you just get rid of the screen, then you'll understand the real world is defined by material relations or whatever it happens to be, and then you'll be free of the kind of domination of ideology. Žižek's theory is a lot more complicated than that, and the way that we try to unpack in the article, so I'm not going to kind of regurgitate it too much here. But needless to say, he points out that many of us are actually pathologically attached to ideology in a way that classical ideology theorists wouldn't necessarily have been sensitive to. And in fact, it determines a lot more of how it is that we comprehend the world than we might think, right? It's not just about not understanding that material relations define relations of power, right? It's that the way that you interact with people in a shopping center can be determined by ideology. The way you look at the environment can be determined by ideology. The way you conceive of ideology can be ideologically overdetermined, right? Consider all the kind of people like Jordan Peterson who deploy the term as a pejorative, right? So again, I won't spoil it. People can go take a look at the article. But that was the kind of contribution that I felt that I wanted to foreground.
Yeah, and as regards, if I can just elaborate a little bit, as regards my section, so it dealt with his conception of dialectical materialism. So Žižek has said before that he thinks that the Marxist left needs a sort of account of nature, right, lest it lapse into this kind of idealism. And he makes the joke about Judith Butler being unable to talk about the glass of water in front of her without couching it in front of qualifiers. But for him, the traditional sort of dialectical materialism, which is produced by Engels and codified by Stalin in the Soviet Union, is inadequate insofar as it sort of subordinates reality to these very kind of mechanical laws, right, that are adapted from Hegel. So Žižek's basic gesture is to say, I think what quantum physics, for example, has shown, Stephen Jay Gould, evolution, is that nature is not something that can be subordinated to these laws. It's not holistic in its functioning, right? There's always something about it which is contingent, that eludes that kind of description. And so he suggests that, in a sense, our capacity to understand nature owes to the fact that humans, as we see in Kant, Freud, etc., are also sort of fundamentally incomplete, in a sense. So nature is ontologically incomplete, and humans are sort of transcendentally incomplete, right? And this is what makes us the same, in a sense, but also furnishes us with a sense of difference with respect to the external world.
Fair enough. Well, so we should also, so we talked about Žižek. We should also meet our other debater. And our graphic designer, Andy, found this video that I believe Daniel Hannan did for esteemed educational institution, Prager University. So let's just give that a watch to get some sense of what we're dealing with here.
Life isn't fair. And you know what? It can't be. Here's the problem. The word fair doesn't mean justice or equity or indeed anything very specific. Instead, it's become a sort of all-purpose statement of moral superiority. Superiority tinged paradoxically with victimhood. Now, fairness does have an exact meaning in certain contexts. For example, if we're playing a game, fairness means that the rules should be applied impartially. When we're kids, and our parents and teachers set the rules, the word still has that essential meaning. It's a young person's way of demanding what we might call equality before the law. But as we get older, the word becomes more of a whine. In the mouth of a teenager, trust me on this, it's not fair means, more often than not, you won't let me do something I want. In recent years, though, something odd has happened. Adults have started using the word in much the same way that teenagers do. More than in any previous generation, people today retain their teenage sense of self-centeredness. They use "it's not fair" as a catch-all complaint, as an assertion of wounded entitlement. Look at a Google graph of the use of the word fairness. From around 1965, it looks like the proverbial hockey stick, flat, and then it suddenly shoots up. We've developed a fairness obsession. But what do we mean when we use the word? Do we mean justice? Do we mean equality? Do we mean need? Or do we mean something else? Suppose you and Jane buy a cake together. You pay $6 and Jane pays $4. What would be the fair way to split it up? You could do it on the basis of proportionality. In other words, you get 60% of the cake and Jane gets 40%. Or you could do it on the basis of strict egalitarianism, half each, regardless of who paid what. Or you could do it on the basis of wealth. Jane has much less money than you for non-essentials like cake, so maybe she should get the larger share. A case can be made for each approach. But the beauty of the word fair is that it doesn't require you to come down clearly in favor of any of them. It gives you the cover of ambiguity. So, for example, when a politician says, "We want the rich to pay their fair share," he doesn't usually mean that he wants the rich to pay taxes at the same rate as everyone else. He means that he wants them to pay extra. The word fair lets him present higher rates of taxation as a form of justice. But only if we don't think about it too hard. That's the beauty of it. Fair doesn't ultimately mean proportionate or impartial or equal. You can use it to mean almost any positive thing you like. I want fairness generally means, look at me, I'm a nice person. Demanding fairness lets you tell the world how decent you are without your actually having to contribute a penny. It's a kind of vanity. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? Let's get real. The only way to distribute the cake is to see how much people are prepared to pay for their slice. Sure, that could leave a banker with a bigger slice than a baker. Sure, we might not like that distribution. We might feel that the baker is doing something more valuable than the banker. He's making delicious pastries while the money man doesn't seem to be making anything except money for himself. But how can we judge someone else's economic worth? You might want bakers to be paid more than bankers. I might want teachers to be paid more than movie stars. Since we all have our own preferences, the only way to measure the economic value of a service is to see how much others are prepared to pay for it. That's what the market does. It aggregates our preferences. It doesn't ask us in the abstract what we think someone else deserves. It tests in reality how many hours of our own labor we're prepared to put in exchange for a product or a service. Under every other economic system, our relations are mediated by accidents of birth and social caste, and financial rewards are determined by favoritism. The free market alone gives everyone the same rights. My money is as good as yours. You can't get fairer than that. I'm Daniel Hannan, president of the Initiative for Free Trade and author of Inventing Freedom for Prager University.
This video was made possible by a generous donation from the GTAA.
Yeah, there you go. So that's Daniel Hannan.
A very generous donation.
Yes. I am not shocked that video was funded by a very generous donation. But Hannan is a former conservative member of Parliament and kind of a, all-around crazy person. But he's, one of the many things I love about that video is, one, that fairness, which, by the way, I mean, is not a concept like, Marx is somewhat dismissive of talk about fairness, or, he'll make comments about how, you can have what counts as fair relative to a mode of production, and you can only get a better concept of fairness with a different mode of production. He'll say things like that in some places, critique the Gotha program. But if you are going to talk about fairness, one pretty obvious point, I think, is that it's certainly true that it's a contested concept, right? Unlike all the other normative concepts, right? Everybody agrees on what freedom requires, or what would count.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All the others are just totally uncontested.
I was about to object, and then I realized you were being sarcastic. So I'm glad I didn't make that interjection.
Fairness is the only one that is disputed territory. You certainly don't have a long history of people having incompatible ideas about what would count as freedom or justice or any of those other things. But also, I don't know. I mean, and this brings us into Matt's philosophical home territory. I mean, I got to think, if I were going to sound off about fairness and and I wanted to I wanted to say it was a poorly defined concept or whatever, especially for a university, right? It's Prager University. I might mention John Rawls, who's a probably the most important political philosopher of the 20th century, who wrote thousands of pages devoted to trying to figure out what, in his view, fairness requires. And not just jump from here are some ambiguities that might exist about fairness to absolutely no one ever has worked out a rigorous conception of this.
Oh, absolutely. And this is one of the things that I thought was really amusing about that. I mean, he might charge people with adolescence, but he has a very juvenile conception of what exactly political theorists have been doing with the concept of fairness for probably about 5 decades right now, since Rawls published his book, Theory of Justice, right? And it's worth noting that Rawls lays out a theory that he calls justice as fairness, right? And defends it for 400, 500 pages, right? So it's not like there was minimal philosophical ink spilt trying to define what exactly this meant. But one of the things that I wanted to say is that in reaction to this, he just doesn't seem to be very cognizant or aware of the fact that any number of social justice conceptions of fairness that have been put forward have very rigorous arguments behind them, often very controversial arguments, and often arguments that are at odds with one another, right? So Rawls puts forward a conception of justice as fairness, which says that, look, fairness is what people could endorse from the original position, right? And I don't want to get into what that all means, right? But he spells out what that entails in great detail through the book, right? Somebody like Michael Sandel would say, look, fairness is what's entailed by the common good, right? And a conception of common good that we would share. And he's written a book lately that's very interesting, criticizing meritocracy on the basis that it's not a view that's actually in line with the common good. We need to actually provide common resources for people, et cetera, right? But, this kind of juvenile dismissal of arguments from fairness on the basis that they're under-theorized or that there's not a really rigorous way of tackling these problems, I would say that just demonstrates profound ignorance on his part. Not to mention, as you said, Ben, virtually any normative concept that you bring up is going to be eminently contested. Like you said,
of course.
not like we have some settled convictions about what freedom entails or what equality entails, or indeed what even law is, right?
Yeah,
if you were to go in a philosophy of law department, people would be arguing with you for days about the right way to understand the law and the rule of law and obeying the law, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and at the end of the video, he gives a argument for capitalism, a moral argument for capitalism, and it's a appeal to a certain conception of equality. It says that in other systems, your station in life is determined by what caste you're born into, or other things having to do with accents of birth, whereas under liberal market capitalism, you can climb meritocratic ladders, so that's better. So I mean that is ultimately a appeal to a kind of bourgeois liberal conception of moral equality, that that everybody deserves the same starting chance or something like that, right? That like in this extremely minimalistic sense, where if you're where Jeff Bezos's son and somebody, and the son of a worker in one of Bezos's warehouses are counted as having a starting chance because there are no legal impediments, to either of them acquiring, great wealth and power, and influence. But of course, that's one conception of what it means to treat everybody as moral equals. There are obviously very different conceptions of what that means. If you read like G.A. Cohen, who's a philosopher actually that Žižek referenced like a couple articles ago, I remember that. Then if you read like his book Why Not Socialism, he goes through a few different conceptions, as there's like what he calls bourgeois equality of opportunity, which is roughly what Hannan says, is defending in that clip. That's basically, well, if there's no legal impediment to you rising, through the ranks, then that's all the equality of opportunity you could ever want. And there's left liberal equality of opportunity, where there, certain kinds of, there's certain kinds of deficiencies or involuntary disadvantages that we might try to compensate for with like Head Start programs and stuff like that. And then there's what Cohen thinks of, at least, as socialist equality of opportunity, by which he thinks that you need to, that even if you have like even saying that some people should have different life outcomes because of different dispositions and cognitive faculties and stuff like that is ruled out, which is, I mean, there's a whole fascinating question you could ask there about, again, mentioned Marx earlier, the critique of the Gotha program, whether this captures, exactly what Marx is saying there or not. But a crucial point to try to get, we established before we started, we are going to have a part 2 of this, but, for starting up part 1 of the Žižek Hannan debate breakdown, is that niceties of like philosophical arguments about justice and fairness and and equality of opportunity and all that stuff aside, like the basic move that he's making at the end is saying capitalism is great, it's the best of all possible worlds because feudalism was worse, and that's
and socialism is feudalism, of course. Remember that, right?
I mean, well, that's
neo-feudalism.
Yeah.
Not completely incorrect, we should say, but I think it leaves something to be desired as an account.
Yeah, right. So either socialism and feudalism have to be the same thing, right? Or else it's just so obvious that socialism would also be terrible that it just goes without saying. It could be just left implicit, and that of course gets us into what they're going to be Žižek and Hannan are arguing about in the debate we're about to start watching, because Hannan is going to lean very heavily on the record of what, depending on your perspective, is sometimes called, was sometimes used to be called actually existing socialism, the sort of system that existed in, the Soviet Union and elsewhere as part of his anti-socialist case. So do either of you have anything you wanted to say to set this up before we started?
Yeah, I just wanted to add about that. One thing that occurs to me about this whole thing with fairness is you know, when he talks about the justification of taxation, for example, right? You know, there's been very, very, you know, obviously strong analytical accounts that have been made, you know, of the inherent, you know, structurally mapped out injustice of the capitalist system. And we could discuss Marx in that respect. I mean, the bottom line here being that, you know, if you recognize that wealth is in some sense socially produced, right, then it follows that if someone's exceedingly rich, it's not just through their own efforts that that's been accomplished. And on that basis, you can justify a progressive taxation. But I think it's very interesting because, you know, when he talks about, and I don't know how credible this data is or whatever, but when he talks about people having used the term fairness more since 1970, I think it's interesting maybe the suggestion that the use of the term fairness has inclined, you know, as global Marxism perhaps has kind of weakened as a social force. You know, so I think that when he talks about kind of the vagaries which are employed in this sort of argumentation, you know, all he's really critiquing is the absence of the articulation of a concrete alternative. Right. And of course, you know, at the level of developing a system of concrete mechanisms which function as smoothly, you know, not to speak of the defects of capitalism, maybe that's never been developed to that point. But I mean, I think it just speaks to the problem of this sort of airy language, right, which Marx, as you're pointing out, was very critical of, and the need for a more concrete kind of critique. Because, of course, then people can turn around and say, you know, look at these people, right? They don't have a clear riposte. But all they're really doing is, you know, celebrating the triumph of capitalism, right? And portraying any kind of attempt to present a dissidential position as a priori wrong, right?
Yeah, there's one last point that I want to... Sorry, do you want to go in?
No, go for it, man. Yeah.
There's one last point that I wanted to make that actually Sandel makes in his book, The Tyranny of Meritocracy, which is that there's a reason why it is that a lot of right-wing economists and figures are uncomfortable with arguments about fairness. It's that there's really no good argument you can make that capitalism is fair under any kind of sufficiently rigorous philosophical basis, right? And this is one of the things that he talks about in the book, where he points out that even the most sophisticated and nuanced right-wing economists and philosophers, people like F.A. Hayek and Robert Nozick, by the mid-20th century, had gotten into the groove of saying, look, there's no way that you can defend capitalism on the basis that it's fair. There are simply too many morally arbitrary circumstances in life. It's very obvious, Hayek points out, that sometimes people get rich because they belong to the Walton family, and sometimes people stay poor because even though they work hard from dawn to dusk every day, they just don't have a job that's going to allow them to get ahead, right? So we should stop making arguments on the basis of things like possessive individualism, right? You know, you work hard, you labor, and then you'll get ahead. Because people simply are not going to believe it any longer because they're cognizant of the fact that the system is deeply unfair. So we should try to make arguments on different bases, right? Either the argument that this is a freer kind of society, or the argument, as Conrad was getting at, this is just going to produce more wealth in the long run, so it's what we should kind of settle with, right? But I think that really testifies to why it is that these figures are deeply uncomfortable with arguments about fairness, because they're very aware of the fact that if you actually start to look at the kind of society around you, you're going to be cognizant of the fact that it's a deeply unfair one. And that might move you at a certain point to say that maybe we could have a more fair society or a better society. And then, of course, how to cash that out is going to vary depending on the figure, right? But I think the left is on really firm ground when it comes to talking about things like fairness, because it's a concept that resonates so strongly with many people, because it is an ideal that, even if we can't label it precisely, is something that means a lot to people, I think at least.
Yeah, I mean, and again, you could make similar, you know, I mean, points about any normative concept, the ones that he makes in the video. I mean, you could say, like, look, if I, like the same, you know, the same structure as the argument about the cake, you could say, like, if I, you know, if I want to go, you know, if Bob wants to go camping, you know, on Jim's property, then if you know, does freedom mean that, you know, that Jim should be free to do what he wants with his property, including excluding Bob? Does freedom mean that, you know, that Bob should be able to do what he wants without Jim calling the cops on him as a, you know, trespasser? Like, you know, like you could make all the same points. I mean, there's the classic, like, Rick Perlstein line, one of his early books. I don't remember who's quoting about how, like, the Goldwater campaign in 1964 happened at the like high watermark of the civil rights movement, you know, and of course the two groups, the civil rights protesters and the Goldwaterites hated each other, but but they were both constantly invoking the concept of freedom. And yeah, sure, the same thing's true, fairness, anything else. I mean, there's this like big normative concepts that deeply resonate with people tend to be super contested. I do take Conrad's point that, I mean, there's the sort of maybe core of like, if you want to salvage something that's not completely ridiculous from Hannan's critique, it's that like most sort of people with vaguely progressive instincts don't really have a concrete alternative to offer to capitalism as it currently exists, to which I would just say, some of us are working on it, stay tuned. But in any case, though, let's start up. Let's get
just
some.
Let me just say that
real quick. Then let's start up. Yep.
I think what we call, really, if you look at it, what we call socialism, it's always the dream of sort of, having, capitalist productivity without having the inequality that it engenders, right? And that's not strictly a hypothetical, right? If you look at the most desirable societies to live in that have been generated, or, the huge strides that have been made developmentally, and, Russia, China, whatever, there's been amazing things, or whether we talk of Sweden, whatever you want, amazing things have been accomplished because of that. Some of them bad, but I think in any case, it would be, horrifying to think that we should simply relinquish that ambition, and let capital do what it will, because it's never generated a society tolerable for humans under those conditions anyway, right?
Definitely. All right.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in to our head-to-head debate on Marxism. Tonight, we are joined by two distinguished guest speakers.
Yeah, that looks like
on the proposition making the case that Marx was right. We have Slavoj Žižek, who is a Hegelian philosopher, psychoanalyst, and political activist. He is the international director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Humanities and the author of numerous books, including his most recent series, Pandemic, COVID-19 Shakes the World, and Pandemic 2, Chronicles of a Time Lost. On the opposition tonight, we have Lord Daniel Hannan, who is a British writer, journalist, and former politician in the Conservative Party. He was the founding president of the Initiative for Free Trade and one of the founders of the Vote Leave campaign. He is editor-in-chief of the quarterly journal, The Conservative. Now, I'm just going to very quickly run through our format for tonight's head-to-head virtual debate. We're going to begin with 10-minute opening statements from each of our two speakers. This will be followed by a 5-minute rebuttal from each speaker. They will then have a 15-minute period in which to ask each other questions, about 3 questions each, I suspect. And we will then take audience questions, which we will field to either the proposition speaker, the opposition speaker, or both, if your question is relevant. And this will be followed by a 5-minute closing statement from each speaker. So without further ado, to make the case for the proposition, it is my great pleasure to invite Slavoj to open the case for the proposition. The virtual floor is yours.
Thanks very much. I'm very glad to be here, but I must warn you, maybe I'm not quite the appropriate person for that, because in many aspects, I'm quite critical of Marx. So I don't think he was simply right all the way through. Absolutely not. So let me begin with a couple of cases. I will try to do it not in high philosophical terms, but from case to case. A couple of topics where I think we can still learn something from Marx. I will skip its too complex theoretical topic, Marx's critique of political economy, which is, I think, still the best description of capitalist dynamic, but we don't have time for that today. I would like to approach just 2-3 topics. The first is freedom, where Marx was right, and not only Marx, even some. This is one of the paradoxical connections between Marx and intelligent conservatives, whom I always admire, that freedom, yes, we are all for freedom, but freedom can only actually work within certain social conditions. The model for me here is language. You know, we think freely in words, But to think freely, you have to integrate, totally assume all the complex rules of language. This limitation is the condition. And of course, the same goes for society. Freedom means I go out, but I know that probably at least other people will respect certain rules, will not beat me, will not pose a threat to me, and so on and so on. Sorry. What interests me?
Can I just ask a question?
Is often wrong in his.
Is it possible that when we do one of these Žižek debates, that we can keep track of how often he says "and so on and so on"? I'd actually like to keep a chronicle of that, and then like compare them to see which is the most of "so on" and "so on" debate ever. Yeah,
no, somebody should definitely do a tracker for those. I did. I actually did manage to a few years ago. I think we originally wrote the paper like 10 years ago, but it was or not quite that long ago, but several years ago. It was only like published, because of a backstory that's not relevant here, like a couple of years ago. But I wrote a paper about philosophy of logic with Tavio Bueno, where he was, I think, a little bit hesitant about doing this, but like I got him to put in like for like there's a sentence that basically ended with et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but I got him to say, and as Slavoj Žižek might put it, and so on and so on and so on, which probably in the place that it was published is like the first time that anybody's ever quoted the guy. But yes, that's
no doubt, eh?
Fair enough.
Empirical analysis. But what interests me is this basic idea that one thing is freedom as a notion in pure ideology and so on. Another thing is what this freedom means, how is it practiced in social reality. What always fascinated me, and you get a couple of examples in Marx, is this idea of a gap between what is, for example, in explicit ideology allowed or prohibited and social practice. What fascinates me is cases where something is officially prohibited, but discreetly in social practice you are expected, even solicited to violate these prohibitions. Another example, even more interesting for me, is the opposite one. When something is guaranteed, allowed, the right to do that is guaranteed on condition that you don't use that right. I mean, examples are numerous here. So what interests me, and here is again a notion which brings me together almost with conservatives, is that freedom is always grounded in what Hegel called Sitten, customs, mores, even the unwritten, usually unwritten rules which tell you how to practice freedom. One of the tragedies today, I think, is that, for example, the new populist right in the United States and so on, but also parts of the left, violate these unwritten rules. So that's the first point. The second point, ideology. I think what we should take from Marx is that the same thing. Ideology are not just ideas. Quite often, certain beliefs function objectively in the sense of impersonal beliefs. You act upon those beliefs, but you subjectively don't take them seriously. You usually say people are today cynics, they don't believe. I think no, people believe more than they. So, I'm sorry for repeating old jokes, but I.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually wanted to pause because this brings up a serious issue and a contemporary issue that we raised in our article, which is actually about the emergence of the alt-right, or what we call postmodern conservatism, right? Because I think this theory of ideology really helps us understand how a lot of these edgelords or performative types emerge in digital spaces. Angela Nagel describes them really well in her book. But basically, you sometimes will encounter these conservative figures who will say, I don't actually believe anything that Trump is saying. I don't believe anything that the political right is saying. All I'm here to do is essentially troll the libs, right? That's all I'm here to do is basically get a rise out of left-wing people. But one of the things that you would immediately want to ask is, well, sure, but why is it always the left end of the political spectrum that you're trying to troll, right? But the more deeper Žižekian point, though, is to a certain extent, you are the way that you act, right? You display your belief systems, not just in what it is that you deny doing, but what it is that you concretely set out to do, right? And so one of the things that we point out is how it is that actually performatively dissociating from Trumpism by saying, I don't actually believe any of these rotten opinions I'm putting forward, I'm just doing it to troll people, is it allows you to take a very minor degree of ideological distance from a concrete position while still holding to that position, not necessarily owning it yet. And it's also a very convenient way of being able to back down from that position when you're confronted with evidence that's actually doing horrible things, right? Like when you can sit there and say, well, don't you realize that Trump lies a lot? A lot of these people will just respond to you by saying, oh, yeah, we know that he lies a lot. He's a bullshitter and all that kind of stuff. That's not why we're doing it. We're just supporting him because it makes you people so upset, right? And these kinds of new ideological dissociations and reassociations are really fascinating, but they're not the kind of thing that can be really well captured by traditional ideology theory, right? Which has this kind of fact reality distinction at its core, right? Because these people will sometimes be very well aware of the fact that Trump is telling lies, right? In fact, they count on it so they can dissociate from them when the time comes, right? But that doesn't mean that they don't act as though they believe what it is that he's saying, which in the long run is all that really matters, right? What you do matters more than how you might ultimately feel in your head, as it were, or in your heart.
Yeah, right.
To which I would just add very quickly that I think that the impulse to sort of troll the libs, as it were, attests to the extent to which liberalism and by extension, in a way, because of the absence of socialist voices, the entire left becomes associated with the status quo, right? So every time we have this position on the left where we're going to disown any kind of radical action, any kind of desire for radical change, that in a way strengthens the role of the far right as the only ones who are capable of doing that trolling. Right, which is why I think we need to have, more progressive programming of this type.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with the conclusion. Although I do have to say that it reminds me of that that Sartre line about arguing with anti-Semites, which was certainly written at a time when there was a much stronger radical left. He says. Never believe that anti-Semites are completely unaware of the absurdity of their replies. They know their remarks are frivolous, open to challenge, but they are amusing themselves, for it is their adversary who is obliged to use words responsibly since he believes in words. The anti-Semites have the right to play. They even like to play with discourse, for by giving their ridiculous reasons, they discredit their seriousness of their interlocutors. They delight in acting in bad faith, since they seek not to persuade by sound argument, but to intimidate and disconcert. If you press them too closely, they will abruptly fall silent, loftily indicating by some phrase that the time for argument is past, which strikes me as a pretty pitch perfect description of what we would now call trolling. So I don't know. I mean, I think that is probably a pretty old right wing posture, but at the same time, I also think that it's true that that by and large we are little enough of a threat that the typical conservative isn't like trying to troll, Marxists, right? They're trying to troll the libs. That's still who they see as their primary enemy. That if anything, they're still doing the classical conservative thing of pretending not to see a difference. So they could red bait liberals. By associating them with socialists, by saying that these Joe Biden liberals want to impose critical race theory, which is also the same thing as revolutionary Marxism on middle America. So, I mean, I guess I'm working my way around to agreeing with Conrad a little bit, because I think that maybe if there were a more powerful socialist left, they'd have to change their rhetorical posture, because they'd probably see that as like a more serious enemy that they had to combat.
Well, it's weird. Just let me throw in really quickly. I find it really strange that, like, if you look at, there is this thing, and you see it even in Peterson's discourse with postmodern neo-Marxism, like, post-structuralists, liberals, whatever, they're secretly Marxist. They want to sue gulags and this kind of thing. But then it's like, if you look at the weird affinity of like Fox viewers for like Bernie Sanders or something like that, effectively the message is that like mainstream liberals are Marxists, but socialists, who may actually have an affinity for Marxian ideas, they're kind of okay, which I find to be a really, really strange posture. But the normal line, I think, about, just aiding and buttressing the establishment, it doesn't work as effectively, right, on those parties.
No, right. I think that's right. I think because they've developed a series of rhetorical weapons for use against establishment liberals, sometimes they don't quite know what to do with anybody who's like criticizing establishment liberals from the left. And it's certainly the case that, like, on the level of like pundits and politicians, the people like that on the allegedly populist right are very, very, very hostile, to even like the sort of Bernie left, but also like they're often manifestly rhetorically at a loss about how to express that, and sort of very eager to like move back to the territory that they're more comfortable with, which is attacking like woke neoliberals. So yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, like, and I also think it is true that, like, certainly on a popular level, I mean, this is Glenn Greenwald interviewed me for a Substack. It came out yesterday. Today's Sunday. Yeah, it came out yesterday, and this is something we got into there. That, like, even though I'm very skeptical about the idea that economic populism is actually a thing on the right, on the level of pundits and politicians in any way that's not just a really sad joke. Certainly on the popular level, right? I mean, whatever. I mean, people, like, just normal people on the grassroots have all kinds of contradictory attitudes, and and there's absolutely like a constituency of people who voted for Trump because they wanted to stick it to the establishment, but who may very well have voted for Bernie Sanders if he'd been the candidate in 2016, because because they know what they they know what they don't like. They're much more persuadable about what they might like. All right, let's get back to it.
I will nonetheless, for the 20th time, repeat a wonderful old joke from Niels Bohr. When a friend asked him, Niels Bohr, Copenhagen, why do you have above your house that horseshoe, object of magical protection against evil spirit? He says, I don't believe in that. Of course not. I'm a scientist, but I was told it works even if you don't believe in it. That's how ideology functions. All these ambiguities, explicit ideology, but the way you are supposed to practice it. I got this lesson in old socialist Yugoslavia, where the whole system worked in this case. If you took official ideology too seriously, you were already considered a dissident. Quickly, I'm approaching conclusion. Critical points on Marx. First one, we have to redefine today radically the notion of proletariat. Who is today under stress, exploited, and so on? The old working class, where you get permanent job, but you are exploited in it, and so on, is almost a privileged position. We have unpaid workers, women's unpaid labor, and so on. You have, we have those who are not directly exploited, but whose conditions of existence are withdrawn from them, like some native tribes and so on, where their natural habitat is destroyed through exploitation. We have immigrants and so on and so on. So I think this focus on the working class is over. If you want to locate who is in big trouble today, you have to change it. Second thing, here my Hegelian side comes. In Marx, you still have some kind of teleology. For me, as a Hegelian, Marx is too much an idealist. To cut a long story short, Marx thinks that there is a historical agent, subject, working class, which the first time in history, for the first time, will do something and will know what it does, in contrast to all other previous movements and so on and so on. If we learn anything from 20th century, it's that this doesn't hold. The same tragic dimension, you do a revolution, a change, you expect to achieve something, things turn wrong, fully holds also for socialist revolutions, if we may call them that. Then I think that with today's so-called rightist populism, I'm not against every populism, but let's call it Donald Trump style, something changed in the functioning of ideology, which was not in Marx's view. He wouldn't be able, I think, to understand it. Look, as I always, as a champion, I say shamelessly of moral, certain basic morality, decency of ordinary people, I would say that if there ever was a postmodern relativist historicist president, it's Donald Trump. If you want old moral decency and so on, Bernie Sanders is much closer to it. And really, to conclude, just half a minute, I think that I don't believe in all that Marxist stuff, big proletarian revolution, communist party, but I think that with what is going on today, the pandemic, other infections on the horizon, global warming, and so on, we will need to counter our usual representative party, multi-party democracy, not only with local mobilization of communities, but also with larger international cooperation. The crises that are in front of us cannot be confronted, dealt with simply through market mechanisms. We need, at least, I don't believe in world government, that would be immense corruption, but some kind of international cooperation for healthcare, food, and so on, some kind of global cooperation. It will become necessary. Stop.
Thank you very much for your speech. You kept it at 9 minutes, which is marvelous. We now move on to our first speaker for the opposition. Daniel, the floor is.
All right. Before we start up, Hannan, any more complete thoughts about Žižek's opening statement?
I thought it was interesting. If you mind, Matt, I thought it was interesting when he talked about, because he talks about what he sees. I think one of the things Žižek objects to in Marx is this notion that sometimes alluded to, though it's inconsistent, that the working class is going to emerge as a historical agency, and all sort of negativity or contingency, right, will be stripped from reality as a consequence of that. There'll be a sort of totalization of the political field. This dream will be realized, and so forth, right? And I do think it's interesting because, thinking about this issue, it really raises the question of how much, the left, as we understand it, right? If you look at sort of the political sequences of the 20th century, the socialist left, is something which is very, very specifically related to the context of working class organization, right? And I think one thing that's been omnipresent, right? It's sort of in left-wing theory, politics, since the fall of the working class, the fall of the Soviet Union, has been this desire to sort of cite a new kind of revolutionary agency, right? So you see this very strongly with someone like Negri in post-operism, right? He's like, lumpen proletariat, shoplifters, digital class. He's always kind of producing these new emancipatory classes. But I think a lot of that, as with their term multitude, it ends up being almost kind of messianic. I don't think we've produced anything like that, to be honest. But I do think it's interesting what Žižek says at the end, which is that, and we could talk about the pandemic and global warming, which are inextricable, obviously. But I think it's interesting what he says about, the need for activism and forms of global cooperation. And I think that in a recent article, actually, with Žižek, he cited global warming. It was interesting, climate change, I should say. He said, because Mao differentiates between the primary and the secondary contradiction. Mao says, well, in our country, maybe proletariat bourgeois is not the primary contradiction, maybe fighting the Japaneses, for example. And Žižek uses this, and he says, well, maybe today, right, insofar as it threatens, the continuity of the human species, maybe climate change, right, is our primary contradiction. So I do think, I think there's been a lot of false starts with this, but I do wonder if you look at the depth of this, which I think COVID has really illustrated, with biological spillover and all of that, if maybe that won't be the organizational basis of the socialist left in the future. And Andreas Malm as well, the eco-socialist, has talked about the idea of what he calls ecological Leninism, right? Drawing a parallel with the crisis of World War I in Russia, right? How that could provide an impetus for the right organization, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, just real quick, I would say that, one thing where I am, in fact, actually, I recall that article that I remember from a couple ago where Žižek cited G. Cohen. The thing that he was citing about was relevant to this point, right? Whether all of the things that that were said about, that Marx thought about the working class, if almost some of those parts of the checklist are true today, what that changes. But I guess one thing I do always want to push back a little bit on stuff like this about is that sometimes I get the impression that when people make critiques like this, it's based on the idea that the thing that makes the working class important in classical Marxism is that workers are the most oppressed or the most miserable part of society. And I don't think that was ever it. Even when Marx was writing, the lumpen proletariat existed. And people who are unemployable and living in the shadow economy on the margins of society were often doing much worse, than factory workers. Peasants existed, and depending on local conditions, in some ways, in some cases, were much more, immiserated and oppressed, than had worse standards of living, than industrial workers. I don't think. The sort of level of oppression, I don't think is the main issue. I think the main reason for seeing workers as the revolutionary subject, the group of people who will do away with capitalism in classical Marxism is thinking that workers have this combination of, one, it's in their interests to discard capitalism, and two, they have the social power to discard capitalism, because there's structural power within the economy that the working class can make the whole machine grind to a halt. So I mean, it's not that So I think that the sort of to maybe caricature a little bit, the Žižek point or the Negri point you're talking about, it's not I think the sort of oppression Olympics aspect of it is a little bit beside the point for I think the reason that Marx and Engels assigned this role to the working class.
I would say it's totally beside the point. I just want to add really quickly, I think we should also remember that, while in the West there's been this scramble to talk about, kind of the new emancipatory class, I feel like what's often lost in this is that, we still live in a world in which there are, industry is far bigger, right, than these sort of other sectors we talk about, tech and so forth. It's just not happening, as much in America, right? You go to Mumbai, you go to China. So I think that often that is lost in the mix. But I always love, in terms of what you're talking about as the special conditions that encourage this sort of revolutionary drive amongst the working class. I always love how Lukács puts that, right? Because he says, the working class, are the ones capable of revolutionizing society because they see themselves as an object. Right, which I always find to be such a, because all the things you're talking about practically, like being able to slam sort of the emergency brake on production and all of that, are very important. But there's also, I think, a crucial subjective dimension, right, which is the experience of proletarianization, of urbanization. It instills a sort of implicit kind of secular understanding of political economy in the working class as well.
Yeah. I'd like to put it a somewhat different way, right? I tend to agree with Sheldon Molin's analysis of Marx, and I just finished reading his collection of essays, and there's a brilliant one in there where he points out that the earlier Marx, Circular Communist Manifesto, may have actually held to a genuinely teleological vision of history. At least that's a kind of argument that the manifesto puts forward, right? Workers of the world unite. You have nothing you lose but your chains. The grave diggers of the future are now present, and eventually we're going to expropriate the expropriators and create an ideal society, right? But even by the time you get to 1852's the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, right? It's very clear that he's become not more cynical, but less teleologically minded. And he's aware of the fact that there are new kinds of coalitions that are forming, that many people, at least in the petit bourgeois, are more attracted to things like nationalism, for example, as espoused by Napoleon III, rather than working class politics. And this is problematic. And so then by the time you reach the 1860s, with the conception of capital as always overdetermined, right? Always creating new kinds of identities, new forms of social organization, any kind of reference to a teleological vision of history of the sort that you'd see in the manifesto really is more or less gone. Every now and then there are a couple of rhetorical gestures that way, but he makes it very clear that this idea that any one group might be able to mobilize and be the exclusive standard bearers for our emancipation is somewhat naive. Right. Now, he never says this explicitly, but I think it's a process of maturation that he went through as he went from being kind of a young firebrand revolutionary, anticipating that the 1840s were going to bring Europe to a halt, to a more advanced, senior, mature scholar who's aware of the fact that things are never really that simple. Right. And I'd also like to point out something just about what Žižek said, which is that I loved his characterization of Trump as a more postmodern, more historical figure than even someone like Bernie Sanders, for obvious reasons, right? And I won't rehash my kind of argument about postmodern conservatism here. But I think that one of the things that's worth noting is that if you look at the kind of things that Trump was appealing to, despite being on the allegedly facts, not feelings kind of crowd, everything was located in this historical narrative of decline and fall. This notion that America was great and it's not great any longer, right? And this is meant to bypass a lot of the kind of rational forms of argumentation that somebody like Hillary Clinton, right, put forward as a position for her presidency. We need to get the economy jump started. We need to integrate into the global community and appeal directly to people's sense of themselves as social beings embedded in historical identity. And there is a kind of elective affinity with that and other forms of left Hegelianism, except for the fact that what he was really talking about was this nostalgic narrative of how it was that once upon a time privileged groups had positions of authority in society. Those have been wrongly taken away from them by the evil postmodern neo-Marxists, and now I guess the critical race theorists. And the only way to bring the country back to greatness was by restoring them to these positions of auspicion. And it's really quite remarkable how often this narrative of decline and fall and restoration works its way into various kind of far-right positions. And there's very rarely concerted arguments put forward for it, right? It appeals almost directly to people's affect and people's sense of themselves as being entitled to more than what they have. But not because they want to create an egalitarian future for everyone, but because they want to raise themselves above everyone else, which is why I think he's genuinely right when he says that Bernie Sanders was the true universalist between somebody like Trump and, his left-wing opponents.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, like, it is also important certainly without denying that, like, racial bigotry and demagoguery was a big part of the Trump appeal. It absolutely was. But, and I think it is also important to note that, like, some of that sense of a lost, lost world that you wanted to be restored, that he was appealing to, certainly in some voters in places that ended up being pretty important in the election, was really very, like, straightforwardly not, about that, although maybe it was mixed up with that in some people's minds, but it was about, like, how, hey, remember when that coal mine was open and you had a job that you could support your family, just by working there, I mean, like, that's what was supposed to be restored, which is again, I mean, why, I remember there was a time in, like, 2017 or so when, I remember lots of people saying, you got to stop relitigating the 2016 election, but I'm going to die before I stop relitigating the 2016 election. Because of course, somebody, with that Sanders kind of universalist position, what would have made that so potent, is that he would have been able to appeal to people who had the legitimate sense of loss in ways that didn't intersect with the sort of more standard reactionary sense of loss that you're talking about. And you know, and yeah, that definitely would have been the more appealing message. I mean, I still believe adamantly that in a world without COVID, you know, Trump would still be president right now. I mean, you know, he got, you know, Biden got a lucky break.
Yeah, and this is one of the points where I like to distinguish between left-wing variants of populism and right-wing variants of populism, right? And this is simplistic, you know, but I can expand on it if people wanted. But typically speaking, you know, left-wing variants of populism do put forward these kind of broad universalistic arguments for fairness and justice, right? That everyone is entitled to what they need in order to live a life of full human flourishing. That's not the case in our society, so we should try to fundamentally change it. And it's also an inclusive demand, right? These are the groups that have been denied those kind of opportunities or what they need to live a life of flourishing, so we need to rectify that, right? Whereas these right-wing forms of populism usually are predicated on theories of loss, right? Once upon a time, we had positions of auspicion and authority and prestige in society. Those have been taken away from us, typically by the undeserving, right? That's almost always the kind of implication, right? And so what we need to do is recreate those kinds of positions or put someone in charge who will, at the very least. And so it's extremely exclusionary in its logic, right? And they could sometimes seem superficially similar, since both of them will usually characterize their enemy as elites, you know, whether we're talking about bourgeois elites or liberal elites in the case of people like Trump's, but they're fundamentally different at their very core. And this is why I'm always a little bit wary about talking about the Sanders-Trump supporter, because even though I can understand the impetus to want to smash the system by whatever means necessary, if we smash the system, we want to make sure to replace it with something that's better. And to this day, I really have very little sympathy for people who said that, well, if I wasn't going to be able to get democratic socialism, then at least Trumpism would be a second best. And my response to that is no.
As like a worked out position, that would be insane. But I think but I think, like, as a realistic read of the minds of some people who do not think about politics all day, like weird people like us do, like, you know, like who are sort of vaguely aware of some of this stuff, and they know what's going on around them, and they know it sucks, and they have a, you know, incoherent kind of sense of dissatisfaction, and it might end up getting to, you know, expressed one way or the other. I think it's something that's important to be aware of, you know, so we can tap into it, you know, because I mean, if you know, otherwise, right? I mean, we've seen the otherwise, right? I mean, like the otherwise is Trump, it's Le Pen, it's, you know, whoever, right? I mean, like that's the alternative. So, I mean, yeah, obviously, I wish that you know, I mean, I wish that everybody had more like worked out coherent worldviews, and, you know, and they weren't in any danger of expressing their incoherent dissatisfactions, you know, with you know, by going to the hard right. But, you know, we you know, smart German guy said, right, you know, we make our own history, but not in conditions of our own choosing. I mean, you know, we do have to acknowledge the existence of the electorate that actually exists.
Can I just say and I want to go back a little bit. Thank you, Ben. That was really nice. I want to just go back a little bit, and I just want to say a word. Not that you were really assailing it anyway, but I just want to say a word in defense of the Communist Manifesto, which Matt was talking about, which is just that I think it's true that as Marx, you know, in some of the later works, and actually 18 Brumaire is only, I think, 4 years after the Communist Manifesto. So the difference in tone may have had more to do with the publishing context than some kind of profound maturation. But I do think it's true in his later works. We could talk about his comments on the Narodnik influence comments and the possibility of the peasant communes in Russia being used to spearhead some kind of revolutionary change and so forth, that he becomes generally more amenable to the prospect of class coalition. So I think that's accurate. But I think one reason I like the manifesto is that if you look at the Paris Commune in 1870, I think, which was more influenced by Proudhon, right, the anarchist, than Marx, one thing that starts to emerge, I feel like, in some of the later works, and you see this in certain ways in Gotha Program, is this sort of magical, spontaneous, you know, view of revolution, right? As if, like, you know, he doesn't exactly see how this is going to concretely happen as the proletariat, more recuperation is kind of happening. So he's saying, you know, like the Paris Commune, we're all going to kind of just take power, right? And one thing I really like about the manifesto, I mean, it's a more provisional, direct sort of political statement, you know, but he's very, very clear. You know, we have the social class. Of course, we can talk about coalitions as well, as he does in the later work. But, we're going to go, and these are the sort of nationalizations that we're going to accomplish, and we're going to have this sort of centralization, and this is what we're going to do. Now, that may not be communism as a kind of utopia, but I do think that if you look at the success of someone like, if you look at the success of the Russian Revolution, on one hand, you had a coalition between the workers and the peasants. On the other hand, Lenin defended the immediate need for an approach driven by nationalization, consistent in many respects with the Communist Manifesto. So I do really appreciate about the Communist Manifesto, how sort of urgently it intervenes in that political situation and puts forth solutions, which are mostly based on government forms of ownership, that can be realized, right? Rather than this more kind of airy, I think, spontaneous vision and maybe Proudhonian influenced vision that starts to creep into his work more after 1870.
Well, I would say, although it's weird because also, that's also the period after 1870 when he starts talking about the possibility of socialist parties taking power through the regular electoral process, at least initially. But yeah, I will say even in the Communist Manifesto, he does talk about coalitions, although maybe not the same kind you're talking about. Like in the last chapter is all about how the communists should relate to these other parties, basically other factions in the 1848 revolution, and supporting whatever the sort of leading edge is that's that he thinks has a chance of taking power in any given situation. But yeah, I don't know. I will also I guess I'd also just say that I think that probably despite the writings about Russian peasant communes and everything that you're talking about, I think that if you look at some of Marx's polemics against Bakunin, maybe he didn't think enough about the cross-class issues, right? Because there are places where like Bakunin, whose views I like overall much less than I like Marx's, but he says things like this dictatorship of the proletariat you're talking about is going to end up oppressing peasants and whatever, and Marx basically says, no, don't worry about that, that's not going to be an issue. And
don't worry about it.
Okay. In the 20th century, I think Bakunin, might not have been totally off base there. I think that could be a problem.
Cross-class coalition, always necessary. My point was just about congealing that into a tangible set of political demands. That's all I was saying. So I think we should look at these writings on cross-class coalitions. Those can be very useful. I'm just a little bit skeptical of that more. I hesitate to say messianic vision, which I do think sometimes manifests after the Paris Commune in his work.
Fair enough. All right, unless Matt's got anything else, let's go to let's watch. We're not going to get through too much more tonight, but let's at least see if we can do Hannan's opening statement.
You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, Karl Marx devised the most lethal ideology ever produced by human intelligence. In the grim reckoning of murder, Marxism stands unchallenged. Look at all the other atrocities we've experienced. The transatlantic slave trade, with all of its cruelties and abominations, claimed perhaps 10 million lives. The Nazis, their terror, protracted by the lights of a perverted science, murdered 17 million people. But communism murdered 100 million human beings. Some of them shot into pits. Some of them starved to death as state policy. Some of them disappearing after the knock in the night into the basements of the secret police or to the vastnesses of the labor camps. How are we to explain murder on such a vast scale? Let's ask one of the anti-communists who managed to die freely in the West, the Gulag survivor, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. This is what he wrote. Macbeth's self-justifications were feeble and his conscience devoured him. Yes, even Iago was a little lamb. The imagination and the spiritual strength of Shakespeare's evildoers stopped short at a dozen corpses because they had no ideology. Ideology. That's what tonight's debate is about. And in particular, this idea that somehow the ideology of Marx can be divorced from its practice. That somehow uniquely among all the ideologies of the world, it should get a free pass in the sense of never being measured against its real world effects. Now, of course, it's true in a Platonic sense that you will never have an example of a perfect Marxist society any more than you have a perfect example of a theocracy or a monarchy or a capitalist society, right? But we can fairly infer differences from what we see in front of us. History has thrown up some pretty good laboratory condition experiments. China versus Taiwan, or East Germany versus West Germany, or North Korea versus South Korea. Societies that were beginning from a similar place and then was subjected to two different styles of government. Now, of course, South Korea is not perfect capitalism any more than North Korea is perfect communism. But I think it is impossible to debate this subject unless we accept the fundamental truth that South Korea is a closer approximation to the market, and North Korea is a closer approximation to a socialist society, and that we infer things accordingly. Now, of course, with all of its imperfections, with the inequalities and the corruption and the occasional moments of dictatorship, South Korea, I would say unarguably, was a better place to live than North Korea. There was no problem of keeping defectors from rushing from south to north, right? We've had 104 years now of real world data. This is no longer just a theoretical argument. It was 104 years ago that the Bolsheviks burst into the Winter Palace and engaged, by the way, in an orgy of murder and looting, destroying priceless works of art and drunkenness. They started as they meant to go on when they ousted Kerensky's social democratic government. Now, ever since then, we have seen the same pattern play out. Every time, show me a socialist country and I will show you a place that has firing squads and labor camps and a repressive dictatorship. The same story every time, from Albania to Angola, from Bulgaria to Benin, from Czechoslovakia to Cuba. Always, it begins with cant about the many, not the few, and standing up for the people. It ends with the arrest of opposition leaders and penury. And always the same story when we look at how it's received overseas. The Western Marxists, the apologists for socialism, hail each new experiment as the new dawn. This time it's going to be different. This time it's going to be bottom up. This time it's going to be democratic. It's not going to be like anything that's ever happened before. And then things start to go wrong. The GDP begins to fall. There begins to be a little bit of popular discontent. But no, don't believe it. This is phase two. This is all just capitalist propaganda. These are the old, powerful bourgeois interests that own the media and are lying to us. It's all going terrifically well. Then the problems become undeniable. You start getting hunger. You start getting riots. You start getting massive anti-government protests. Oh, then it's phase three. This is sabotage by the CIA. Don't worry. The people will see off the wicked capitalists and bring ultimate victory. And then, happened most recently in Venezuela, but it happened previously in every single socialist experiment, you get to phase four, the total collapse, the collapse into poverty and misery and brutal dictatorship, at which point suddenly we're told, oh no, that wasn't real socialism. No. Real socialism has never been tried. Real socialism is a democratic, cuddly, altogether more benign concept, absolutely removed from these ugly real-world examples. Well, ladies and gentlemen, to see what is wrong with that kind of sophism, let me ask you to consider making that argument about any other belief system, about any other political creed. Can you imagine somebody in a debate like this coming before the Cambridge Union and saying, well, you can't judge fascism by the 1930s regimes that called themselves fascist. No. Real fascism has never been tried. We have to judge it as a textbook theory, not by these rather tawdry real-world experiments. Of course, no one would argue that. And if they did, they would be rightly howled down. And yet, somehow, we have this blind spot. We insist on judging the free market by its necessarily imperfect real-world examples, but judging communism only as a textbook theory. this House believes that Marx was right. I mean, where do we start with this? I'm tempted to fall back on Nietzsche's observation that you can't refute a disease. Marx was wrong about everything. He was wrong about history. He was wrong about politics. He was wrong about economics. And I'm not just talking about the moral error here, although with 100 million murders carried out in his name, I'd have thought he has a pretty serious case to answer. No, I'm talking about how he was wrong on the most measurable, empirical level. Every important prediction he made, every one, turned out to be false. He said that free markets would destroy the bourgeoisie, would concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a handful of oligarchs. In fact, the free market has enlarged the middle class everywhere it's been practiced. He said that capitalism would run out of resources. He never foresaw the unlimited resource of human ingenuity. He said that the rich would get richer and the poor would get poorer. He called it his theory of immiseration. In fact, the rich got richer and the poor got richer too. In fact, during the old cadger's lifetime, the average family in this country where he was living when he wrote that increased its living standards by an almost unbelievable 300%. And he wrote, of course, that in the end, his theories were ineluctable. He saw them as scientific truths, not as political opinions. There was an inexorable process that was going to bring about perfect communism and a withering away of the state. Well, to put it as neutrally as possible, we are still waiting for that development. And yet, he has this group of apostles in every country, like doomsday cultists, constantly explaining away the failure of their prophecies by saying, yeah, but this time it's different. This time it's really going to happen. This country is different from all of the ones that have gone before. No, it isn't. We're dealing with a design flaw, not a bug. The murderousness, the repression, the petty cruelty is intrinsic in an ideology that denies human nature and tries to force people into doing things that are, in the exact sense, unnatural, inhuman. Karl Marx never murdered anyone himself. Sure, as far as we know, that's true. As far as we know, neither did Adolf Hitler, right? But that doesn't exculpate them from the deeds carried out in their names and in obedience to their doctrine. This is what he said in the Communist Manifesto. The one way in which the murderous death agonies of the old society and the bloody birth throes of the new can be shortened, simplified, and concentrated is revolutionary terror. And he meant it. And his apostles took him at his word and carried out unspeakable cruelties in the belief that somehow, if only they got through that phase, utopia waited on the other side. You can't make an omelette without cracking a few eggs. Well, ladies and gentlemen, setting aside the rather vast and significant fact that human beings are not eggs, you show me one case in any time and any place where the omelette actually emerged. It's the same story without exception. The Marxist experiment leads to broken shells and broken countries and broken bodies. This story shall the good man teach his son.
Thank you, Dan.
I mean, that was kind of embarrassing.
I have a lot to say. I have a lot to say about that. I don't know. Do you mind if I?
Go for it.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it kind of makes me appreciate Peterson because at least he did like the high school rendition of the Communist Manifesto rather than like the high school rendition of the Black Book of Communism. Yeah, with this, he started out and he said he said the slave trade only killed 10 million people. I'm just thinking in my head, like presumably if you're, have slavery, you don't want to have them die because that would kind of deprive you of your basis of income. He mentioned the Nazis killing a lot of people. As I recall, the communists played the principal role in defeating the Nazis. He talked about 100 million people dying, and he mentioned starvation. So I'm assuming like the Great Leap Forward is really central to his statistics, which was a famine. So it's a little bit difficult in terms of the attribution of agency. But of course, all the most highest mortality famines in history have happened in China. As for these historical laboratory conditions he talks about, I'm not really sure that they have a placebo for historical experiments. I'm not sure that they're exactly laboratory conditions. But I would say that I think that from Ataturk to Robespierre to the genocide of indigenous people, capitalism has always been when he talks about breaking eggs? Does he think capitalism doesn't break eggs? I mean, it's always required an immense violence to establish its sort of inceptive conditions. And as even these examples he gives are very, very dicey. East Germany was the richest country in the entire Soviet bloc. It wasn't a horrible place to live. You know, I'm not saying there weren't certain repressions, but it's not this sort of perhaps how he describes it. Taiwan and China are completely different. I'm not sure that China is the example I would give if I was trying to talk about, you know, national economic failure. North Korea was wealthier than South Korea until about the late 70s, about when the communist bloc began to decline. Also, I would finally add his points about Marx. I'm not sure if I got them all down here, but he says Marx said capitalism would run out of resources. I don't know if that. I don't think Marx ever said that. I mean, I think he talked about, you know, the reproduction of inequality and the risk that would cause. He talked about how the poor, their average quality of life or their wealth has increased. In fact, it seems to me that Marx's later work, he shifted toward a kind of relative immiseration hypothesis where he acknowledged that could be the case, right? But said that, you know, the gap ultimately will increase, or that there can even be exceptions to that under certain economic conditions. Marx maybe, you know, didn't always forecast precisely when communism would arise, but I think in his Capital Volume 3, just says in the long run, which is quite vague. As for this omelet emerging, we have some very good examples of successes that have been created by socialism or communism, from, as we say, you know, Sweden to potentially Russia in certain respects, China. But, you know, it's hard to make an omelet properly when, you know, your omelet's constantly taken out by a CIA coup. So I think that's another thing, and maybe points to the problem with his presupposition of laboratory conditions, as he says.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would point out that the one, his one quotation, like he said, there's a lot of summary of Marx in one quotation, which he said was from the Communist Manifesto. It's absolutely not from the Communist Manifesto. I think it's from a article in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, but it's definitely post-communist manifesto. Not that matters very much, except like that it speaks to Hannan's sloppiness. You know, I mean, it's in the context of the 1848 revolutions, which were, you know, democratic anti-monarchist you know, revolutions, not, you know, in which, you know, pro-working class factions tended to get, you know, iced out very quickly, right? You know, so it's he's not talking about communist revolutions at all, you know, which is pretty important context for any time when the young Karl Marx might have, you know, gotten too zealous about saying that they should be, you know, winding people up against a wall for the sake of winning quickly. But I'd also say that, yeah, I mean, this first of all, the idea that only 10 million people died because of the slave trade is ridiculous. If, you know, because, like, yeah, I don't even know what that means, right? I mean, like, the way he put it, the transatlantic slave trade, made it sound like he might have, like, literally just meant the Middle Passage, but certainly, like, people being, you know, people dying decades earlier than they would have otherwise because they were being worked to death was a feature. I mean, like, that was just an ongoing feature of slavery, you know, especially in the Caribbean, you know, like Haitian slavery. You know, it was like constant turnover, you know, because people were dying so quickly, you know, when they were imported to Haiti and, you know, worked in the sugar fields, despite the fact that, as you said, there's an incentive, obviously, not to have your property die off, you know, so you have to buy a new slave. But certainly, like, okay, it says, would we say this about fascism, you know, that this fascism that existed wasn't like real fascism? Well, no, but there are some pretty obvious disanalogies between the two cases, like the fact that there is essentially no history of fascism as an intellectual tradition before fascism existed as a thing as like a governing, you know, as a governing party, right? You know, in Italy and then Germany, that, you know, that there are like a few fascist writings here and there, you know, like generally weird and incoherent. But I mean, it's not an intellectual tradition at all. I mean, that's not like that doesn't mean there aren't fascist intellectuals. I remember I made a comment like this once in the Michael Brooks show, and there are people who really like try to push back against this, nitpick this, like, oh, Ben's saying that there aren't any fascist intellectuals. Yeah, there are fascist intellectuals, but that doesn't mean that fascism is an intellectual tradition, right? You know, it's something that, you know, that exists in the political realm, and then sure, there are a few intellectuals, who would make, in some cases, very sophisticated, like Carl Schmitt or Heidegger, but but who'd make like rationalizations of it. It's not like you'd had several decades of an extremely worked out body of fascist thought, before the first fascists started to take power. I mean, that's just silly. I mean, there's also Christopher Hitchens, of all people, actually after his post 9/11 turn to the right, still pushed back very hard against his friend Martin Amis when Amis wrote his book Cobra the Dread. He made the same argument essentially that Hannan is making, equating Marxism with fascism, and like one of the points in their subsequent exchange of letters, which includes a three one word sentences from Hitchens to Amos: "Don't period, be period, silly period." He, in that exchange of letters and essays, one of the points that Hitchens makes is that it is very easy to imagine a set of circumstances under which the Russian Revolution, might plausibly have landed at a more humane place, which is that if the original 1905 revolution had succeeded, so it wasn't happening against the backdrop of the massive amount of bloodshed that had happened throughout Europe and from World War I for years, before it started. He also points out, when, of course, you can't say, oh, here's the set of circumstances under which Nazism wouldn't have been that bad. There's also point, that's like, look, with the Russia, I mean, forget Marxism, even specifically the Soviet experience, we have like the left opposition, Trotsky and the workers' opposition earlier under Kalante. There were no like dissident fascists with better, more democratic versions of fascism that they were advocating. I mean, I think that for self-evident reasons, that's not a thing that exists or could exist. And it's also just, I mean, like if the idea, somebody in the chat pointed out about, John Stuart Mill, support for British colonialism, which certainly racked up a considerable body count. By the way, I'd argue that like reducing the evils of slavery and colonialism to the number of corpses is kind of obscene, but that doesn't stop, we wouldn't say, John Stuart Mill's philosophical ideas were all discredited by his actual personal support for this. Never mind. Or John Locke, same deal, for the colonization of the Americas, which was genocidal, which Locke supported and made philosophical rationalizations for the slave trade, which Locke was personally involved in, and also in a complicated way, his defense was limited to war captives, but also philosophically defended. Like nobody holds that against those guys in the way that we hold having been claimed by later authoritarian regimes against Marx and Engels, and it's really like, I mean, he said, "Oh, how would we feel if somebody said that you can't judge, ideological claim by things that have been done in its name?" Well, the same way we feel about it in every other case, presumably, right? I mean, how many, like. By some estimates, as many as 4 million Vietnamese peasants were killed by the American Empire in the 1970s, end of the 60s, and early 70s, certainly like 1 million by the most conservative estimates. Human beings were burned alive with napalm and torn apart by cluster bombs, which was being done in the name of certainly capitalism and also allegedly democracy, even though the regime that was being supported wasn't at all democratic. But that was certainly Johnson and Nixon's war rhetoric. Are those things permanently discredited by that? I mean, certainly not in the mind of Daniel Hannan. And I guess the other point, like just because people have heard me say this before, but just really quickly before I throw to Matt, like the thing that always kills me about this. As somebody points out in the chat that, sometimes the lazier renditions of this list will include Pol Pot, despite the fact that Pol Pot was actually being supported by the United States in as a Cold War way to undermine, Vietnam and the Soviet Union. But like the most crucial point is, look, if we're going to say this is what was being, if you're going to cite Marx, supporting revolutionary violence in 1848 in the context of democratic revolutions against monarchy, you should also say something about the rest of his expressed opinions, and the rest of his expressed opinions were radically different, from what happened in the Soviet and Soviet style countries in the 20th century. Now we could argue about what the reasons for that are, or whether a better version would be possible, or if the deformation of those societies were inevitable. All complicated arguments that I'm willing to entertain, different perspectives on. But if you want to know what Marx actually said about how he wanted, socialism to come about, or what he thought it would look like, I mean, he thought it was going to come about through mass majoritarian working class action, which is not at all the trajectory in most of the countries that Hannan named, which is crucial because the people who take power are going to be the ones exercising power, and then also when Marx's explicit model of what an immediately post-revolutionary transitional society should look like was the Paris Commune, which was extremely democratic, and maybe he criticizes it for not nationalizing the bank, and also for not immediately marching on Versailles, but he also praises extensively in the Civil War in France some of the most ultra-democratic things about the Commune, like the fact that all state officials were immediately recallable by the constituents for any time, for any reason, factories being turned over to workers' associations. And so, I mean, if you're going to say, oh, this was being done, at his directive, whatever, that like, no, I mean, this is very starkly different from the kind of post-revolutionary transition that Marx was talking about. And then I guess very, very last point, like the most ridiculous part of this is always the argument from Venezuela, because if you're going to argue that without getting into the finer points of what we should think about Maduro, or what the cocktail of factors is that's led to Venezuela's, misery in the last several years, like, it just should be ruled out right off the gate that Venezuela, has experienced social collapse because they were just too damn socialist. It's like too much socialism for society to bear. Because even at the height of Hugo Chavez's welfare state, the public sector in Venezuela was smaller as a proportion of overall employment than the public sector in France, never mind the public sector in Sweden or Norway. I would say, if anything, what Venezuela shows is that in the context of Latin America, with this sort of like really vicious, entrenched local oligarchies and the sort of constant omnipresent hand of American imperialism, then, very mild social democratic efforts end up facing a tremendous level of resistance, which can sometimes lead to this sort of spiral of escalation and repression, that you've seen in certain cases. But it's certainly not, I mean, if you're going to say, oh, look, this is what you get, for doing all these socialist economic policies, then you need to explain how it is that Sweden has gone much further down that path than Bolivarian Venezuela has, but somehow or another, nobody in Sweden is, eating out of the trash, or
they're white though. It's okay, if you're not white, you do that, then that's really suspect. I got
okay, so
bomb you.
The laws of economics work differently depending on skin tone. So fair enough. All right, Matt, thoughts about Hannan's opening statement?
Sure, I'll just say this, and then I do have to go. But there are a lot of things that jump out immediately. One is that he does a kind of comparative analysis of communism with capitalism and socialism with capitalism, while very, very heavily skewing the results in his favor. And I should just be forward in saying that I do think it's actually important for contemporary leftists to acknowledge the failures of many forms of Soviet totalitarianism or Maoist totalitarianism in the 20th century. I think it's a bad look to just try to deny that there were a lot of mistakes and very many bad things that happened. And I think it's better to be cognizant and honest about that. Okay. But if we're going to do that, then one of the things that we need to point out is that, especially for a defender of colonialism like Hannan, and by the way, I'd like to point out he wrote a book, How We Invented Freedom, which apologizes in many respects for British colonialism. Well, between 1492 and 1600, about 56 million people were killed either directly directly or indirectly as a result of colonial activities by Europeans in North America alone. Right? That's a staggering number when you think that the population is estimated to be between 60 to 65 million prior to contact with European civilizations. Right? Much of this was advanced by war, smallpox, slavery, basically recreating serf-like conditions in the region, you name it. Right? The 20th century doesn't actually fare much better. Actually, the estimation is that between 25 to even 50 million people were killed as a result of European colonialization. That's not even including, by the way, the efforts of the fascist powers, who are also involved in mass efforts of extermination, often with colonial intentions, deeply inspired by the British Empire. Hitler was very overt about this. So I think the comparison is extremely skewed in that respect. So let's just be very clear about that. And then I ultimately very much agree with Ben and his comments also that even to try to compare something like the slave trade to mass atrocity by saying, well, less people died in slavery, kind of misses the point of what's noxious and bad about slavery. Amongst other things, the fact that it lasted for 400 years and kept millions of people in positions of indentured servitude. And then even after it was done, that wasn't the end of it, right? Essentially, slavery reasserted itself in the form of sharecropping and then Jim Crow laws that kept people down for another 80 years or so, right? Now, on the other side of things, I think that Ben is right as well, that if you're going to actually make a meaningful comparison between the worst of communism and the worst of capitalism, you need to take into account all those things. But if we're going to be talking about the best that socialists have to offer, I don't see why there's any point in actually talking about something like Venezuela or talking about something like Cambodia, which is problematic as well because of the Cold War association. I think we should be talking about Lula and the Workers' Party dropping poverty from 12% to 6% over the period of 8 years, right? Against hugely entrenched powers that were very insistent that Brazil's levels of inequality should remain at about 50% being in the hands of the top 5% of the population and very little going to everyone else. I think we should be talking about Nordic democracy and the experiments that have been undertaken there. I think we should be talking about co-determination in Germany, one of the wealthiest countries in the world with some of the finest automobiles on the globe. Very, very much driven by workers' efforts. Workers have an investment in actually making sure that their companies remain innovative and cutting edge, in no small part because they actually have some power, which is something that Reagan and neoliberalism tried very, very hard to get rid of by blocking even the very tentative efforts at achieving something like workplace democracy in the United States or in case of the UK, Thatcher, right? None of these examples are something that he brings up. And I think it's very obvious why he wouldn't want to bring them up. Because going back to the very first point I made initially, I think that people increasingly are aware of the fact that these are far fairer societies, that people get far more opportunities to live lives of human flourishing within them. Are they perfect? No society is perfect. But there's something a lot better than what we've had under neoliberalism for the last 40 years. And I think people on the right are very afraid that as time goes on and inequality gets worse, more and more these are going to be the kind of societies that people choose to emulate or demand that their politicians emulate, rather than the kind of competitive, militaristic, imperialistic world that people like Hannan favor.
Yeah, I mean, and it is important to say that, I mean, like, if we're just kind of doing like radicalism on the internet, it could be very easy to dismiss some of these examples, but like these are massive accomplishments in terms of alleviating human suffering that were brought about to a great extent, by the efforts of socialist and socialist-inspired, movements. I mean, even like, Lula, you mentioned, as much as he, to become president, finally, he had to moderate, his economic platform a lot, right? And do from where it was earlier as a militant union leader and, what the Workers' Party had been, like even the sort of very mild social democratic, reforms that he brought about, which not much, by first world standards, were enough to lead to this massive reduction in poverty, and then also goes back to the point we're talking about with Venezuela, were certainly enough to stir up like the really ferocious resentment and hostility of both Uncle Sam and sort of the local kind of oligarchy, left over from the history of colonialism. I mean, like the apparently one of the common complaints during the members of the Brazilian elite, who later support Bolsonaro, was that because of these reforms, and people being able to go to college for the first time and all that stuff, Brazil was starting to have a middle class, and they'd say, oh, the airports are starting to look like bus stations, meaning, that like darker skinned people who, previously would have lived in favelas and, would be unable to take airplanes, were suddenly able to do that. And that contributed to a sense of the world collapsing. I mean, if you look at like Nikki Fujimori in Peru, and some of the like ranting and raving, that she's been doing since losing the election about communism, and this is going to be the death of the market and all that stuff. I think you see a lot of those same anxieties, about like disturbance of neo-colonial racial hierarchy, basically coming out there, because that's what that's what's defended the system. I mean, if you want to talk about the and yes, I completely agree with you, Matt, right? I don't think we should airbrush at all how bad some of the Stalinist omelets are, but for God's sake, let's also not airbrush how bad the capitalist and imperialist ones were, and just how many damn eggs were broken to make them. So I'm sure we all have tons more we could say, even just about these opening statements, but we do need to cut it for tonight. We are going to finish this next Sunday, same time. Matt?
Oh no, I was just doing this.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if you were holding up your finger like the Q&A opening, holding up your finger, or your other. Yeah, so we're going to finish.
Depending on how people want, they can interpret it as a peace sign, or they can interpret it as a victory sign. Either way, I think works.
There we go. So we're going to finish this up next week at the same time. Meanwhile, tomorrow night, if tune in then, I'm going to have Anna Kasparian from the Young Turks and Jacobin's Weekend Show, and Jason Miles from This Is Revolution. Also, a couple people from Buffalo DSA on to talk about India Walton's victory in Buffalo, which is a big deal. First time a self-described socialist is becoming mayor of a major city in the United States since 1960. So all good stuff coming up tomorrow at 8. Thank you guys so much. I'll see everybody on next week.
Okay. Thank you.